Mentioned by the BBC, Damiba is wanted by Burkina Faso for, quote, criminal embezzlement of public funds, illicit enrichment, corruption, aggravated receiving of stolen goods, and money.
For 3 years, Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba lived in political exile so comfortable it almost looked permanent. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He gave lectures, met visitors, and moved around Lomé like a man whose story was already over. No arrest warrants, no diplomatic pressure, no signs that Ouagadougou even wanted him back. Then, without warning, everything snapped. One quiet night, a phone call came from a number he didn't recognize. By morning, he was in custody. By the end of the week, he was on a plane to Burkina Faso. No public resistance, no long legal fight. Just a sudden return after years of silence. Which is strange because if the Burkinabe state wanted him, it could have acted long ago. Nothing about Damiba's location was secret. Nothing about his presence was new. So the real mystery isn't why he was arrested. It's why exile stopped protecting him, and what changed inside Burkina Faso that made this moment unavoidable. Let's find out. The first thing Burkina Faso discovered wasn't a plot. It wasn't a meeting. It wasn't even a message. It was a payment that didn't make sense. On paper, it looked boring. A small transfer between two private companies, one registered in Lomé and the other linked to mining logistics in northern Burkina Faso. No weapons, no politicians, no obvious reason for attention. Exactly the kind of transaction that disappears inside thousands of similar movements every day. But this one triggered an internal flag inside Burkina Faso's financial intelligence unit for a simple reason. The beneficiary structure was hidden too carefully. Layered companies, nominee directors, indirect family links. Someone didn't want to be seen. When analysts reconstructed the ownership trail, the name didn't appear immediately. It took weeks of cross-referencing corporate records, travel histories, and phone metadata before the pattern emerged. The same intermediaries kept surfacing across unrelated businesses. The same legal firms appeared in multiple registrations. The same relatives acted as consultants in companies that never consulted on anything. Eventually, all those lines converged on one person living quietly in Togo. Damiba. Not as a director, not as a shareholder, as the invisible endpoint. This is where the story shifts from political to operational. Because the money wasn't being used for comfort. It wasn't rent. It wasn't living expenses. It wasn't academic work. It was moving through logistics firms, transport contracts, and procurement channels that existed for one purpose only: to move people, equipment, and information without attracting attention. In West Africa, that kind of infrastructure doesn't exist for business. It exists for influence. The amounts were deliberately small, nothing that would trigger international banking alerts, nothing dramatic, just enough to pay drivers, storage handlers, and communication relays. A financial heartbeat, not a flood. Exactly how underground networks stay alive without exposing themselves. And once Burkina Faso realized what the money was actually doing, they understood something far more dangerous than any public accusation. Damiba wasn't waiting for an opportunity. He was already building one. This is why Ouagadougou didn't start with arrest warrants or press statements. They didn't want to scare the network. They wanted to map it. So instead of blocking the transfers, they followed them. Every payment became a tracking device. Every shell company became a doorway. Every intermediary became a data point. What emerged wasn't a coup fund. It was a shadow supply chain. Companies that handled fuel, firms that controlled transport routes, contractors with access to military facilities. Private couriers operate between Lomé, Niamey, and Ouagadougou. None of it was illegal on its own. That was the brilliance of it. Every piece looked legitimate, but together, they formed a system capable of moving resources across borders without oversight. And at the center of that system sat a man who officially had no power, no office, and no political role. That's when Burkina Faso stopped treating Damiba as a former president. They started treating him as an active operator, which leads to the question that changed everything. If this network wasn't designed to take power directly, What exactly was it designed to activate? The network wasn't designed to seize the state. It was designed to hollow it out from the inside. Once investigators began tracing where the logistics companies were operating, a pattern emerged that felt too precise to be a coincidence. The transport routes didn't connect random cities. They intersected with specific military zones. The contractors weren't supplying markets or factories. They were servicing barracks, storage depots, and communication hubs. This wasn't preparation for a coup. It was preparation for paralysis. The next layer of the investigation uncovered names, not famous ones. Not generals, not politicians. Mid-level officers. The kind who never appear on television but control the practical machinery of the army. Logistics commanders, signal specialists, fuel coordinators, men who decide whether convoys move, whether radios work, and whether weapons reach the right units on time. Each of them had one thing in common. All had served under Damiba. All had been quietly reassigned after Traoré took power. None had been dismissed. None had been punished. They were still inside the system. And that was the point. Damiba didn't need loyalty from top generals. He needed quiet access to the arteries of the state. Not men who could command, but men who could delay, misroute, miscommunicate, and disappear information at exactly the right moment. The plan wasn't to overthrow Traoré. It was to make him look incapable. Delayed fuel deliveries in one region, unexplained communication failures in another, convoys that arrived hours too late, intelligence that never reached commanders. Nothing dramatic, nothing traceable, just enough dysfunction to make every failure look organic. In politics, visible enemies unite people. Invisible decay breaks them. And this is where the alleged assassination plot enters the story, not as a central goal, but as a multiplier. Removing Traoré would have accelerated collapse, but even without that, the system was already being set up to fail slowly. The genius of the strategy was its invisibility. No single officer knew the full plan. Each believed they were acting independently. One thought he was protecting his career. Another thought he was preparing for a future shift in leadership. Another believed he was just staying loyal to an old commander. There was no command center, no meeting room, no manifesto, just a distributed network of people waiting for the same moment without knowing it. And that's why the financial trail mattered more than any intercepted message. Because the money didn't connect people directly, it synchronized them. It ensured the right people were in the right positions when the moment arrived. But what Damiba didn't realize is that the very decentralization that protected his network also made it vulnerable. Because once Burkina Faso's intelligence services noticed overlapping behavioral patterns, unusual travel, similar financial activity, and shared intermediaries, they didn't need to catch orders. They just needed to observe movement. And slowly, without arresting a single person, the state began to see the shape of something that had no official structure, but very real operational coherence. That's when the strategy collapsed. Not because it failed, but because it became visible, which leads to the next revelation. How did a government barely 3 years old manage to detect a network designed specifically to avoid detection? The answer is that Traoré didn't try to hunt conspiracies. He rebuilt the environment so conspiracies couldn't survive. After taking power, one of his first quiet decisions was to abandon the traditional intelligence model Burkina Faso had inherited from France, a single central agency collecting information, issuing reports, and reacting to threats. That system depended on hierarchy, paperwork, and long chains of command. It was slow, predictable, and easy to manipulate. Traoré replaced it with something far more uncomfortable. Internal surveillance without a center. Instead of one intelligence body, he created overlapping monitoring units embedded directly inside military formations. Their job wasn't to identify enemies. It was to observe behavior. Who travels where? Who speaks to whom? Who changes routine? Who suddenly gains access to money, vehicles, or equipment they didn't have before? No arrests, no interrogations, just patterns. Every unit monitored another unit. Promotions were temporary, deployments were constantly rotated, commanders were switched mid-operations, officers were moved just long enough to prevent loyalty networks from stabilizing. The result was structural instability, not chaos, but uncertainty. In this environment, long-term coordination becomes almost impossible. You can't build a network if nobody stays in one position, nobody knows who reports to whom, and nobody is sure who is observing them. Damiba's network depended on slow trust. Traoré's system destroyed trust by design. The state didn't need to intercept messages or hack phones. It only needed to notice anomalies. A fuel officer suddenly traveling twice as often. A signal specialist using private couriers. A logistics commander meets the same civilian intermediary in different cities. Each event meant nothing on its own, but together they created behavioral fingerprints. And that's how the state discovered something more dangerous than a plot: coordination without central command. The moment this became clear, Burkina Faso didn't move to shut it down. They let it continue. Not because they were weak, but because they needed it to grow visible. Every additional transfer, every unnecessary meeting, every repeated intermediary helped complete the map. The network was unknowingly drawing its own blueprint. By late 2025, the intelligence picture was no longer theoretical. It was operational. The state knew which officers were involved, which companies supported them, which routes they used, and which foreign contacts connected them. At that point, arresting individual officers would have achieved nothing. It would have cut branches but left the trunk alive. The trunk was still in Togo, and that's when the strategy shifted from internal containment to external confrontation. Not with public accusations, not with diplomatic pressure, but with a single message sent through legal channels. Not to punish, not to threaten, just to ask a quiet question backed by evidence. Do you want to host a retired general or an active destabilization operator? That question didn't require a political answer. It required a survival one. Which brings us to the moment everything changed. Why did Togo, after years of silence, suddenly decide to pick up the phone? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Togo didn't change its mind because of politics. It changed its mind because the evidence stopped being deniable. For years, Damiba's presence in Lomé was treated as harmless. He was officially a private citizen. No public statements, no political party, no armed group, just a former leader living quietly under regional courtesy. As long as nothing traced back to Togolese territory, there was no reason to act. That illusion collapsed the moment Burkina Faso shared the financial map. Not accusations, not intelligence rumors. Actual transaction chains showing how money moved through Lomé-based companies before resurfacing inside Burkinabe military infrastructure. The documents didn't just show that Damiba was involved. They showed that the Togolese financial space was being used as a staging ground. That changed everything. Because now Togo wasn't hosting a guest, it was hosting an operation, and that creates a completely different risk. Once a country becomes a logistical hub for destabilization, it attracts unwanted attention, regional scrutiny, security sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and, in the worst case, accusations of indirect complicity. Togo's leadership understood this instantly. The problem was no longer Damiba. The problem was traceability. If the network stayed active and if something went wrong inside Burkina Faso, Lomé would appear in every investigation, not as a neighbor, as a facilitator. That's why there was no public standoff, no negotiation, no court drama. Behind closed doors, Togolese security services did their own verification. They checked company registries. They reviewed transaction histories. They compared names. And they reached the same conclusion that Ouagadougou had already reached. Damiba wasn't just living in Togo, he was using it. At that point, keeping him became more dangerous than handing him over. Protecting him meant owning whatever happened next. Extraditing him meant cutting the chain clean. So Togo acted fast. Not for Burkina Faso, for itself. This is why the extradition felt so sudden. It wasn't sudden at all. It was the end of a quiet internal risk assessment. The moment Damiba crossed from political exile into operational liability, his status expired. The phone call wasn't a warning. It was a procedure. From Togo's perspective, this wasn't a betrayal of a guest. It was a containment decision. Remove the node, isolate the network, erase the country from the future story. But here's the part most people miss. Burkina Faso didn't just want Damiba removed from Togo. They specifically wanted him returned alive, publicly and legally. That choice reveals the real ambition behind the operation. Because if the goal was simply neutralization, there were easier options: silence, disappearance, indefinite detention. None of those requires courts, guarantees, or international documentation. Instead, Traoré insisted on a formal extradition process with written protections and legal framing. But why would a government facing active destabilization prefer a slow public trial over a quick, invisible solution? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Traoré didn't want Damiba erased. He wanted him documented. In African power struggles, disappearance is the oldest solution. Leaders vanish, cases fade, files close, and networks quietly reassemble under new names. Silence protects everyone. Memory dies. The system resets. That is how shadow power survives decade after decade. A public trial destroys that cycle. Because a trial doesn't just punish a person, it freezes a moment in history and forces it to speak. Financial records become permanent. Testimonies are preserved. Relationships that once existed only in whispers turn into legal facts. The past stops being negotiable. This is why Traoré rejected the easy path. Killing Damiba would have solved nothing. Detaining him quietly would have ended the story. Letting him disappear would have protected every network he ever touched. But bringing him back publicly, under extradition agreements and legal guarantees, turns him into something far more valuable than a defeated rival. He becomes a living archive. Every intermediary he used, every officer he contacted, every company that moved his money, every foreign channel that stayed open becomes part of a traceable structure. Not a theory, not intelligence, not rumors, evidence. This is the part that makes regional elites uneasy. Damiba didn't operate in isolation. His financial structures crossed borders. His contacts moved through shared military institutions. His logistics channels involved contractors who still work in multiple countries. A real trial doesn't just expose one man, it exposes an ecosystem. And once an ecosystem becomes visible, it loses its greatest weapon: invisibility. For decades, African shadow politics survived because everything was temporary. Power was seized, lost, forgotten. Nothing stayed on record long enough to become dangerous. Leaders knew that even if they failed, exile would erase their footprints. Traoré is trying to break that logic. He is turning politics from a battlefield into a crime scene, from heroic narrative into forensic reality, from legends into documents, from memory loss to institutional memory. If this works, African politics enters a new phase where ambition carries long-term consequences, where losing power doesn't just mean retreat, but exposure, where influence is no longer something you can deny, but something that can be reconstructed years later through records. That's why this case isn't about justice in the moral sense. It's about power becoming measurable. Once power becomes measurable, it becomes risky. Once it becomes risky, elites become cautious. And once elites become cautious, entire political cultures change. This is what makes Damiba dangerous even in defeat. Not because he can still destabilize the state, but because he can destabilize a tradition that protected countless others before him. The tradition of forgetting. Traoré isn't just punishing a former leader. He is attempting to install a new rule inside African politics. Your past will not disappear when you leave office. It will stay, recorded, searchable, and usable. And that creates a fear far deeper than prison. It creates the fear of being permanently remembered, which leaves one final question hanging over the region. If Damiba's trial truly opens the archives of shadow power, how many leaders will realize that the system they thought was buried is about to testify against them? Damiba's return doesn't close the story. It opens a door that has never been opened before in African power politics. For the first time, a failed leader is not disappearing into history. He is being pulled back into the present and forced to exist inside a system that remembers. That alone changes the emotional logic of power. African politics has always operated on short memory. You seize power, you lose power, and eventually your name becomes a footnote. People move on. Institutions forget. The system heals by erasing. But this moment refuses erasure. Once a state chooses to document its own internal enemies instead of burying them, something irreversible happens. Power stops being a myth and starts becoming material. Not symbolic, not rhetorical, but measurable through contracts, transactions, testimonies, and timelines. Politics turns into a ledger. This is why Damiba's extradition feels heavier than previous arrests or coups. It signals that African states are beginning to treat political betrayal the same way corporations treat fraud. Not as ideology, but as a traceable process with paper trails and long-term consequences. And that shift has implications far beyond Burkina Faso. Because if this model holds, it doesn't just apply to Damiba. It applies to every general who thinks exile is insurance. Every businessman who finances instability. Every foreign partner who operates through unofficial channels. Every elite who believes influence can exist without accountability. It means the old escape routes are closing. No more safe capitals where defeated leaders reinvent themselves as analysts. No more comfortable transitions from commander to consultant. No more pretending that power disappears when titles disappear. The state is learning how to store memory, and memory is dangerous. Memory means future leaders will inherit evidence instead of rumors. They won't need loyalty oaths or secret informants. They will need databases, records, financial histories, legal archives. Once those exist, politics changes shape. It becomes slower, more cautious, less theatrical, because every action creates a future file. This is the real transformation happening in Burkina Faso. Not a shift in ideology, not a change in alliances, a shift in how power relates to time. Before, African power was momentary. It existed only in the present. Once you feel, the past dies with you. Now, the past survives. And when the past survives, it becomes leverage. Damiba is not being brought back to punish him. He is being brought back to anchor a new rule. That political actions leave permanent fingerprints. That destabilization has a memory. That influence cannot evaporate just because geography changes. This is what makes Traoré's strategy so disruptive. He is not just confronting external enemies or internal conspirators. He is redesigning the psychological contract of leadership itself. Power is no longer something you can gamble with and forget. It becomes something you carry long after it ends. Which is why the most dangerous consequence of this case is not what happens to Damiba. It's what happens to everyone watching. Every officer will now think twice before aligning with hidden networks. Every financier will hesitate before funding instability. Every leader will understand that failure is no longer an exit, but a potential investigation. The system is being rewired from heroism to accountability, from legend to evidence, from silence to record, and once a political culture learns how to remember, it can never return to forgetting. So the real ending isn't about Damiba's fate. It's about Africa entering a phase where power no longer disappears into history, but accumulates inside it. Which leaves the final question that no one can answer yet. When a continent stops forgetting its political past, will its future become more stable or more dangerous than ever? Let us know in the comments section what Traoré should do now. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.